Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, we're often immersed in the heavy details of a particular issue or project. It's beneficial, if not mandatory, to every so often take a step back and evaluate the big picture. This season's theme is Zoom Out. We have all been immersed in life of a global pandemic, and we're going to make sure with each story this season that we step back, look at how the issue we discussed will be impacted both by our new normal and scratch that. Go back. We're going to make sure with each story that we step back and look at how this issue will be impacted by our new normal.
Michael, yeah, and before we get in today's episode, we probably should just bring on today's special guest and not have any most of the fanfare, because this person's joins us so much. Calling them a special guest is the wrong word. He's just a series regular now.
I agree, Brad. He definitely doesn't need a special introduction, even though he may want to be treated like he's special. We're happy to bring back our partner, Jay Reyero, for another episode this week.
Thanks, guys, and it means a lot to me to have me back so often. When I heard about today's story, it really took me back in time to my first professional job. Can either of you guess what it was?
Well, I actually know this because you told me about it. I asked you how you got such an easy cell phone number to remember.
Hey, what is the number? 8675309. Or is Jenny getting my number? Does anyone know?
Brad, so painful. Now, audience, you know what life is like at ByrdAdatto. The overarching just dad joke theme kind of permeates our office at all times. And for those of you who don't know, that was a dad joke reference to the 1980s and a song. Sorry,
it was just too easy, Michael. Actually, I know this answer too, Michael. One of your first jobs, Jay, was working at a wireless company selling cell phones.
Correct. Yeah, one of the perks of the job was rather than accepting whatever number was going to be automatically assigned, I could actually call in, work some magic, and pick the easiest number to remember. So that's how I got such an easy cell phone number. But no, thinking about today's story, I was reminded of all of the popular phones that I used to sell. So, Michael, what's your guess as to which phone was the most popular?
Well, I'm guessing it wasn't the Motorola Dynatac.
Going back to the 80s, the cell phone of the 80s, it was the size of a brick. It was made famous by Gordon Gekko in the movie Wall Street. I think people closer to my age might think of Zach Morris from Saved by the Bell. But yes, Michael, that was just a little bit before my time, although I did come across a Motorola bag phone, kind of a late 80s alternative. But that wasn't it. Brad, what's your guess?
All right. Well, I guess I'm not allowed to talk about the 80s anymore since I start with an 80s song. But you and I both love science fiction movies. There was a movie that came out that had a pretty cool phone. And so Neo used it in the movie Matrix. Is that the phone?
The Nokia 8110, or I guess as some people will say, the Nokia. That phone was infamously referred to as the banana phone. And that's close. Right brand, wrong version. No, the most popular phone at the time was the Nokia 5110 with all of its snake glory, if you can remember that game. I preferred the Motorola StarTAC. It was the first flip phone, and I carried it on a belt clip holder on my hip, so anytime it rang, it felt like a Jedi with a lightsaber.
I just have to say, you're just talking trash as an old cell phone carrier by calling it a Nokia. We're from Texas. It's a Nokia.
For today's story, we can use Nokia.
Okay, well, that's good. I can understand that word. Well, I'm glad we all took this trip down memory lane, but how exactly does this relate to today's story?
Well, you know what all these phones had in common, other than being tagged vintage on Google searches? They didn't have video capabilities. And so thinking about the technology of the phones that I sold, It's incredible to think about their evolution to where they were to where they are today. And that's becoming a popular and integral part of the practice of medicine.
Totally agree. Having a video on your phone now, it's great because obviously it's another way to connect with people. And then for our clients in the healthcare industry, it's a simple call that enables them to interact with those patients face to face or otherwise. And it's not surprising then that the telehealth has exploded and become much more accepted, not only by the patients, but now by states and their licensing boards.
That's true, Brad. But even though telehealth is more accepted in today's healthcare, there are still rules at play. And if you aren't careful, you could find yourself in a situation similar to our story today.
Michael, that's right. Our client in today's story was a physician that worked with providing telemedicine services in multiple different states. We'll call him Dr. Nokia, or what was Jay's version?
Nokia.
Michael, what's your preferred?
I reject the cell phone salesperson pronunciation. We'll go with Nokia. Dr. Nokia.
Okay, it's done.
Before we get started, Brad, you referenced a different term. You said telehealth. I believe that's the first vocabulary word of the day. Jay, can you briefly explain the difference between telehealth and telemedicine?
Sure, and this is actually a pretty common issue because the terms get used interchangeably. So generally speaking, telehealth is going to be a broad term. It's going to cover any health services that's provided using telecommunications or some kind of other information technology. Telemedicine then is the subset of that, where we're specifically talking about the practice of medicine using telecommunications or information technology. So, each state may have different definitions. Texas, for example, excludes telemedicine from its definition of telehealth, so they don't overlap. But generally speaking, telehealth is a broad term. Telemedicine is a subset of that.
Perfect. Thank you, Jay. And now, honestly, Michael, I think we had two vocabulary words because we keep saying Nokia differently. In today's story, we are dealing with telemedicine, as Jay was just explaining to us, and the impact, obviously, it's having now in the practice of medicine. And so we're going to start with our story with Dr. Nokia, who was in the wellness space and particularly involved with hormone replacement therapy. His role was to conduct this physician consultation with the patient seeking treatment from this telemedicine company.
So give us a sense of what the process looked like for patients interested in treatment.
This process is the typical process we see with a lot of our telemedicine clients. So, this one I'm about to explain is about as well as I can explain any group that does this. So a patient is interested in getting help. Mostly they find them online, and then they'll sign up for some forms and fill out some medical history online. A representative of that company would then contact the patient and go through all the information and flush out their medical history and any more in-depth information they needed. And after that, if the patient is still interested in receiving hormone replacement therapy, they are required to get certain diagnostic tests completed. Once all of that is done, then the patient is scheduled to have a telemedicine consultation with a physician, in this case, Dr. Nokia.
So you basically described the first part of a good faith exam, something we've talked about in prior podcast episode, the Med Spa Widowmaker. And we talk about all the time with clients. It sounds like it was a thorough process and much more comprehensive than others we've encountered before.
Yeah, no, definitely, Jay. They actually had developed a lot of policies and protocols that they had in place.
Okay, well, this sounds good so far. So continue on what Jay said. What about the second part of the good faith exam and the actual consultation with Dr. Nokia? What did that involve?
So once the patient completed this initial process and the schedule for the consultation with Dr. Nokia would conduct the telemedicine consultation with the patient, reviewing all this medical information that they gathered, all the tests they had, the patient's goals from health or wellness or otherwise. And based on all this information, Dr. Nokia would then diagnose and prescribe a course of treatment.
Well, if that's all of the story that you have, this can be a fairly short episode because I haven't really heard anything that raises alarm bells. Sounds like the process generally followed all the rules we walk our clients through involving the good faith exam. So there's got to be a plot twist coming.
There is a plot twist. Jay, you're so smart. You must have listened to our episodes before. When the Arizona Medical Board opened up an investigation, that was our first of our plot twists here. And what happened was, after obtaining some records of all the patients treated by Dr. Nokia in Arizona, the medical board selected just 2 patients that the medical board would then review. In the investigation, once they started looking into it, the medical board determined that Dr. Nokia had deviated from the standard of care, buzzword, in the treatment of both of these patients.
Well, I assume they went through the process for these patients that you had described just a few moments ago. So what were the patients being treated for, and what did Dr. Nokia prescribe?
Well, yeah, they did. And so one patient was evaluated for low energy, weight gain, described libido that was decreased, and that, simply the evaluation of the other person was they were old like Michael Byrd. It was really weird. I actually read it. That was the actual diagnosis, Michael.
Well, you got to describe the next vocabulary word, libido, after this.
So, basically these are very, the entire process, though, they went through for this particular series of was all done by telemedicine with this consultation with Dr. Nokia. And based off all this information that he had sitting in front of him, he came up with a course and treatment involving, testosterone, or HCG or vitamins or amino acids, or other types of course of treatments that are pretty standard when someone has these types of symptoms and they're trying to counter with some type of wellness.
So where did the standard of care fall short in their cases then?
Yeah, the most concerning finding that the medical board had was that Dr. Nokia failed to establish a patient-doctor relationship before prescribing all this hormone replacement medications.
But so you said Dr. Nokia went through the normal process, so wasn't there a telemedicine consult that would have established that relationship?
Great question. This is why Jay is the smart one of the group. There is the plot twist here is that under Arizona rules, before you prescribe, you have to have a doctor-patient relationship. And so you must either conduct a physical examination of that patient or have had a previous established doctor-patient relationship.
Wait, Brad. How can you use telemedicine if you've never had a previous established doctor-patient relationship? As conducting a physical examination of a patient via telemedicine would seem impossible.
Another good point. This is why Michael is the third smartest person on this podcast. So it's a good question. And for the audience, as you heard, Jay was the first. Now, under Arizona rules, they do allow physical examination to take place via telemedicine, but only, and I stress only, if it's conducted in a real-time encounter with audio and video capability. In Dr. Nokia's case, with these 2 patients, the telemedicine encounters were conducted with audio only, aka on the phone call.
So because Dr. Nokia couldn't see the patient, he technically didn't form the required relationship before treating them. So let's think about what would happen if he had had an iPhone and was FaceTiming with the patient. Would that have solved the problem?
Another great question. It probably would not have been that simple in this case, given there's some other standard of care issues that we identified. In the findings, it was determined that Dr. Nokia failed to discuss or consider other potential reasons for these patients' symptoms, and again, failed to conduct a physical examination to look for signs of the reported symptoms or rule out other causes. There were also monitoring requirements associated with this prescription of these types of drugs, and none of this was done via the use of telemedicine. As such, Dr. Nokia's failures to pause and understand the bigger picture now has his license on the line.
Well, that's quite a plot twist. Let's take a quick commercial break, and when we come back, we can talk about some of the issues that arise with the use of telemedicine.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd, and our series regular, Jay Reyero.
Brad, this season's theme is Zoom Out, and you just told us Dr. Nokia's story that involved telemedicine. As part of our Zoom Out theme, let's start with the bigger picture and how telemedicine is viewed by medical boards throughout the country.
Yeah, like many other things in healthcare, unfortunately, there is no uniform rule for telemedicine. And I know that some federal organizations are trying that, but it's different. So because of that, every single state is going to be different and have their own unique rules. Some states are more lenient, while others have more restrictions. So you have to be really careful when you're practicing in the telemedicine realm in whatever particular state you are, and you need to understand those state-specific rules and requirements. And just because something works, again, in one state does not even mean your neighbors next door in that state, it'll be fine.
And Michael, do you remember when Teladoc first started operating in Texas and it was using its phone-only service and how that just kicked off a long fight with the Texas Medical Board?
Oh, yeah. It was a huge deal in healthcare in Texas, and it went on for years. I remember how big of a deal this fight was because other states had already solved the issue and people wanted access to their service.
And Texas is a great example of kind of the evolution of telemedicine and how really just recently it's all changed. Because at the time, Texas didn't follow other states in welcoming telemedicine into the state. It had some very strict rules that kept telemedicine from really taking off. And essentially, the Texas Medical Board's position at the time was to forbid all telemedicine without an in-person visit being involved. And eventually, that fight resulted in legislation that abolished that requirement and allowed for the physician-patient relationship to be established via telemedicine and set forth some specific technologies and other things to do so. But it removed such a big barrier to telemedicine. And this legislation change was not even 5 years ago.
Yeah, and establishing that patient-physician relationship via telemedicine is the key in all the areas, and that's where the states all differ.
Right, and if you think about telemedicine visit, the type of patients, there are really going to be two categories, and you mentioned it in the story earlier. One are the established patients, which are fairly straightforward, as you have some kind of pre-existing relationship in place and are just using telemedicine in follow-up or for a new issue, but they're established. The second, and what we typically encounter most often, is where you're using telemedicine with a brand new patient, and this is really where the details matter.
So naturally, the first place you have to start is identifying the technical requirements of a particular state's telemedicine law. As we saw from Dr. Nokia's story, even though conceptually it sounded like the clinical treatment of patients was compliant, it was in the details where things fell short.
Yeah, that's right. When looking at these rules, you have to determine how exactly to establish the provider-patient relationship when using telemedicine. So it may allow you to use audio only or store or forward technology, while all included some version of interactive real-time video conferencing. Just as important, though, are the technologies expressly prohibited, which include patient-submitted questions or emails or texting or faxing. None of that is considered telemedicine. And we get this question all the time is, what if they text me a picture of it before the call and then I talk to them about the picture? Well, no, that's still not good enough because that's not interactive real-time video.
And that was one of the issues for Dr. Nokia when he failed to conduct a video with his consultation. The Arizona Medical Board concluded that Dr. Nokia didn't properly establish the required physician-patient relationship.
Right. And as we saw with Dr. Nokia's case, Arizona rules required a face-to-face examination before prescribing controlled substances and allowed this through telemedicine, but only if there was audio and visual technology used. So Dr. Nokia's failure to adhere to this visual requirement piece meant that he didn't satisfy a piece of the rule from the very beginning.
And I think that's an important thing to note is that this particular rule came about because the prescription was involved. And a state may have heightened set of requirements when it comes to prescribing via telemedicine. But understanding the requirements is sometimes the easy part. I think the hard part comes when actually applying the rules to a particular set of facts regarding the clinical operations.
What do you mean?
So one important theme emerges that I think that really forms the foundation of practicing telemedicine, really regardless of state. And that's the standard of care. So when I talk to clients about telemedicine, one of the things that I constantly come back to during the discussion is that no matter what, you must provide the same level and type of care via telemedicine as you would in person. And anything short of that's going to be problematic.
That's a good point, and it leads to the problem that people tend to think that they can use telemedicine for anything. Basically, because telemedicine is generally accepted now, it can replace all instances of in-person visits, but in reality, that's not necessarily the case. Really, whether or not telemedicine makes sense in that context is going to depend not only on the particular facts and circumstances, but also what is acceptable in the medical community.
Great point, Michael. And this is where clients have to walk through the specific facts of their intended operation, asking questions like, what providers are involved? What types of medical services are they clearing through telemedicine? You really need a complete picture to be able to determine how to properly implement telemedicine, if you can at all.
So, Brad, it's been bugging me, so I have to ask. In Dr. Nokia's story, you never said how the Arizona board investigation got triggered. Did one of the patients complain, or was it a competitor?
Jay, that is a great question. And, for those who've listened to our episodes in the past, they know that those are typically the ways. But no, in this case, it was neither. It wasn't a patient or competitor. Arizona opened the investigation because they received a disciplinary alert from another state where Dr. Nokia had been disciplined for failing to meet the standard of care for, you can guess it, prescribing medication via telemedicine without establishing a physician-patient relationship sufficient to come up with an informed diagnosis and provide appropriate care. That disciplinary action caused that ripple effect with multiple other states, including Arizona.
So what happened to Dr. Nokia with all these state issues?
Well, Dr. Nokia couldn't completely escape disciplinary action, but the good news was that none of the states that ended up doing an investigation actually revoked his license. He actually learned a very valuable lesson that he needed to zoom out by taking a giant step back and reevaluate the entire model.
So before we wrap up this episode, let us zoom out like Dr. Nokia, and let's re-examine the big picture. As we come out of the pandemic, what do you see happening with telemedicine in our post-pandemic world? Jay and Brad, we can start with you, and then I'll share my thoughts.
So I'll go first. So during the pandemic, the reality was telemedicine was the only option at times. And so you saw various ways that the rules surrounding telemedicine were relaxed to allow for it to be used more often and make it easier for patients and safer. And telemedicine made healthcare available in a safe way. So I think because people have experienced this and providers have implemented it, and it has proven to be effective during the time, I think you'll see the push to adopt these relaxed standards as the new normal once the pandemic ends, and possibly, calls to further loosen it even more to make it even more widely implemented and become, the primary way of practicing medicine.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that, Jay. We've seen both Congress and many states are already starting to address that, as Jay described, because the pandemic forced all practices to reevaluate how they interact with patients. This can be as simple as using telemedicine occasionally, or as Michael and I, when we met someone just recently, they have streamlined their entire process when they onboard new patients with these assessments by using telemedicine. The medical provider should still examine the use of telemedicine as any other app on their iPhone or tool in their toolbox. But like with all new shiny objects in medicine, it still must be done in a compliant way. So providers should hit that pause button, understand their state rules before dialing that number.
Yeah, picking up on your theme, it's like with anything new, you have your early adopters out there, and then it gradually becomes accepted. And I think what we've seen is both with the doctors and the patients that telemedicine became normalized through the pandemic. And so I agree with you guys that I think that there's a chance that the kind of the loosened standards will continue because it has been such a saver for healthcare, and doctors and patients are using telemedicine in new ways, like Brad said. I think we also need to watch out for kind of the boomerang effect, where now that it's normalized, some bad actors will start figuring out some loopholes, and then they'll start tightening the regulations up again.
And these are all great points. And, next Wednesday, we're going to dive into some headlines that happened a couple years ago where, as Michael, you just said, some boomerang effects where bad actors got into the med spa industry and it caused a huge ripple effect when doctors and providers got handcuffed. Michael, that's all the time we have for today, but join us next Wednesday when we have lessons learned from the Texas Botox arrest. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.